Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be responding to Inspiring Philosophy's video on the problem of evil. Just to get this out there, I consider IP to be a friend, and we talk a good bit. I don't want this to be taken as an attack on his character, as I do like what he does, but I simply have disagreements with him over this. With that out of the way, let's get on with the list.
But first, we need to begin by going over what the problem of evil is and the different types of arguments. I would suspect the problem of evil has been used for millennia, but the logical problem of evil was famously given by the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, and is what most people think of when they think of the problem of evil. Premise 1. If God is all good, then he wants to stop evil. Premise 2. If God is all powerful, then he can stop evil. Premise 3. There is evil. Conclusion. Therefore, there is not an all-powerful and all-good God. However, this argument is not used by most modern atheistic philosophers, because it ignored another important attribute of God, his omniscience. Being that God is all-knowing, he might in his perfect knowledge have very good reasons for allowing evil that we cannot see.
The logical problem of evil can still be used by people, and atheist philosopher Graham Oppy goes into that in his paper, Arguments for Moral Evil. There are a lot of assumptions that Plantinga makes that don't work. In Plantinga's counterfactuals, a constraint is put on God when making universes that isn't consistent with libertarian freedom. The counterfactuals that Plantinga goes into are either part of the truth-making core of the world, or they are not. To quote Oppy, on the one hand, if they are then part of the truth-making core of the world, then it follows from the libertarian account of freedom that no one ever acts with libertarian freedom, for there is no other world with the then same truth-making core in which agents do anything other than what they do in the world in question. On the other hand, if the counterfactuals of freedom are not then part of the truth-making core for the world, then it follows from earlier noted consequences of the libertarian account of freedom that these counterfactuals cannot constrain the choices which a perfect being can make, and nor can they constrain the actions which that being can perform. So the universe will either be fixed when the perfect being creates it, or it will be dependent on features of the universe in question. With this libertarian free will, it should be the case that an agent can do freely an action in particular circumstances at a time in the world, but if an agent does some other action in circumstances at a time, it will be the case that what the agent will do won't be part of the truth-making core. Plantinga relies on true, ungrounded counterfactuals of freedom. One could take into account Plantinga's free will defense with the following argument as featured on page 77 of Graham's paper. Premise 1. It is as close to certain as you please that a perfect being can choose to make a universe in which everyone always freely chooses the good. Premise 2. Necessarily, universes in which everyone always freely chooses the good are non-arbitrarily better than universes in which someone sometimes freely chooses the bad. Premise 3. Necessarily, if a perfect being chooses between options and one option is non-arbitrarily better than the options, then the perfect being chooses that option. Premise 4. Hence, it is as close to certain as you please that if a perfect being makes a universe, then it makes a universe in which everyone always freely chooses the good. Premise 5. It is not the case that everyone always freely chooses the good. Premise 6. Hence, it is as close to certain as you please that our universe was not made by a perfect being. More is gone into in regards to this by Sean Meisler in his paper Transworld, Depravity, and Divine Omniscience. Now, I believe I don't have to go into the whole couldn't God make a world where every person freely chose an act, always with moral good again. I'll add that even if there are some possible worlds God logically can't actualize, it doesn't follow there is no possible world God couldn't actualize without evil. As Sean says, say I encounter only two morally significant decisions over the course of my life. At the moment of my choice, I will make the morally right choice in at least one possible world, and make the morally wrong choice in some other possible world. As we are searching for a world with moral good but no moral evil, let us leave aside the world 2 in question. In the first world, once I reach the second morally significant choice in my life, there will be one possible world in which I make the right moral choice, World 3, and one in which I make the morally wrong choice, i.e. World 4. Could not God have actualized World 3? We cannot suggest that God's choosing to actualize any particular world impedes on my freedom. After all, if God is to create anything, one possible world must be chosen for actualization. It would seem that God could actualize World 3, and thus a world with significant moral freedom but no moral evil would hold even with a lot of moral decisions. Now that should be enough for that point. Let's go more into the video.
Genocide is very much human. When the Bible says humans are totally depraved, it is meant to be a very serious claim. Matt Dillahunty and many others have argued the Bible is an evil book that poisons our minds. Telling us we are totally depraved is a horrible thing to say and degrades us as humans. Well, that would only be true if the Bible was lying and we are not actually depraved. If I was suffering from narcissism and you told me I was a narcissist and needed to get psychiatric help, that would only be a horrible thing to say if it was false. If it was true, then it might have been the best thing you could have told me, because you would want to see me get help and overcome my mental disorder. So if the Bible claims that we are totally depraved, we ought to test that against reality, and it will help us better understand what moral evil is. What I'm about to go over will be a hard pill to swallow, and it will take some time to unpack, because once we understand human nature, I suggest the problem of evil falls into context.
What IP is going into is the notion of human depravity, and after this, he goes into several examples of people doing apparently bad things. This notion, as at least Alvin Plantinga's seen it, is internally inconsistent and has to change terms in order for it to be resolved. As the earlier paper noted by Sean goes into, this notion of transworld depravity is logically impossible, as there's no morally significant choice to satisfy Plantinga's premise that if a certain state of affairs were the case, that said depraved individual would go wrong with respect to the action, as it seems to require a certain fact about the world with epistemic relation, as a knowing agent couldn't have probability beliefs towards it. Plantinga's defining of God's knowledge as necessarily, if God knows in advance that X will do A, then X will do A. If God knows in advance that X will do A, then it is necessary that X will do A. And Sean points out actually that this makes transworld depravity impossible. To quote Sean on this, assume that no antecedent set of conditions sufficient to ensure that P will in fact go wrong with respect to A is in place, yet God nonetheless knows the result of the action. In this case, the justification for the belief in question is insufficient for certain knowledge, implying that God would both know by assumption and not know due to a failure to meet the knowledge entailment, that P will in fact go wrong with respect to A. It seems implausible to say that an entity is unfree if it is compelled to act in a certain way by its own nature. Thus we might look to a set of circumstances actualized in S. To sum up this point, we never have reason to think any person is transworldly depraved, as that would overall entail that the person isn't free. Transworld depravity is incompatible with divine omniscience, as no action could meet Plantinga's notion that S includes P's being free with respect to A, and that if S were actual, P would go wrong with respect to A, as God couldn't know which possible world to actualize, as the world God most wants to actualize will be full of free, morally good decisions. If God were to know which possible world this is, it would preclude the possibility of it being desirable. I'm going to go more into transworld depravity and its problems in a bit, but I'm going to let IP continue so in order to get more.
On every continent in every century, genocide, rape, and war has been committed by humans, because that is what humans do. And I've only stuck with recent examples. Our history is filled with countless more examples, and probably even more acts of genocide that were lost to time. Humans are murderous, selfish, evil creatures, and we have the audacity to call genocide inhumane. I would bet the hundreds of species we've directly caused to go extinct wish we were actually inhumane.
It is good to note that yes, it is true that humans do things that seem to be very immoral, that doesn't show, however, that humans are naturally inclined to do that, or are sort of infected with evil like a disease, but rather that there are a set of conditions that can lead to someone to do horrible acts. Humans also do much good, as charities will show. Now, as IP knows me, he knows that I have a bit of knowledge of the Bible and how I spend a considerable amount of time trying to learn about it. I want to hit IP not just on the philosophical side of this, but the theological side of it. And to do that, I'm going to challenge original sin and the depravity narrative. To begin with, it must be recognized that out of the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity is the only one that holds to the idea of human depravity and original sin. Theologian Danielle Schroyer tells about this in her book Original Blessing. She argues against original sin as it makes Jesus, in her words, a get-out-of-jail-free card and debt officer, rather than a blessing that restores our fullness with God. The church for 400 years had no concept of original sin, and the first 1,000 years focused on Easter and not the crucifixion, with paradise being in this world. On her view, God didn't come down because we are separated by sin from God, but rather it's that God came down as to help humanity embody the fullness of life that we were made for. Blessing would be our nature, not sin. And while this doesn't solve our sin problem, it offers an invitation to be with God, as our goal in life is to live in the right relationship with God. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann affirms the blessing theology. He says, and I quote, "The creation narrative is a statement about the blessing God has ordained into the processes of human life. There is a tendency in some theological traditions to articulate a deep gulf between the goodness of God and the unhealthiness of the world. But here that gulf is denied. The world itself is a vehicle for the blessings God has ordained in it as an abiding characteristic." Things like Genesis 2 verses 4 focuses on humans as both the good and bad thing with creation. When God created the world, He anointed it with goodness. We are blessed with life from God and built our own self-worth to match that of God and not people. God blesses us so we can bless others and they can bless God back, as it is a perfect cycle. Blessing is seen as an invitation to join with God. God designed us to live in harmony with Him and others, and failure to do so results in a world of suffering. One must also note that Genesis 3 wasn't mentioned at all in the rest of what's considered the Old Testament, as it wasn't central to biblical understanding of sin and humanity, and Adam, Eve, and the garden are only referenced 3 times in the New Testament. Romans 5:12 just uses Adam as a type to represent human experience, as Adam is sinful like we are. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 21 through 22 also is setting up Adam as a universal type. In 2 Corinthians 11 verse 3 as comparing Eve's gullibility to the Corinth churches. None of this speaks of original sin, but rather just overall says humans are sinful and we share Jesus' resurrection. Adam and Eve are overall universal types, as they represent all of humanity and how we see things about them through us. Walter also notes, "The text is commonly treated as the account of the fall. Nothing could be more remote from the narrative itself. In general, the Old Testament does not assume such a fall. Deuteronomy 30 verses 11 through 14 is more characteristic of the assumption that humankind can indeed obey the purposes of God." Danielle Schroyer also goes into this, as I quote, "Consider the possibility that while Genesis 3 is a great text to spark questions, it isn't trying to answer a good number of those questions. It is not trying to determine how sin entered the world, or where death came from, or why people sin. To sin against God is to fail to live up to God's purposes. Genesis 2 verse 17 shouldn't be considered a threat but a clear acknowledgement of life and its rules, as straying from God leads to death, such as how Adam and Eve were equals in Eden till they disobeyed God. Cain wasn't infected by original sin, as God still tells him to do well, which shows he can act for good, and God still protected him with a marking. Human nature, and not sinful nature, is what makes it harder to see God. Genesis 3 can be said to be the first moment humans experienced God's abundance of creation, as he could have given them just life, but he gave them more. God never forbade Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of life, but they decided to be disobedient. God wasn't punishing them per se for taking from the tree of life, but rather he protects them from the tree and sends them out in peace, as an analysis of the word washiyahu goes into. Genesis should be read as a story of childhood, as God gave his children the ideal home to be raised in, with the eating of the apple being a symbol of growing up and them having to leave the home. Them leaving the home will make them rebel, but it will make them appreciate God and come back to him when they are matured. Last point I'll put here is that people will say, why did Jesus experience God-forsaken sin then? Danielle Schroyer puts it best. Jesus experiences God-forsakenness not because of God, but for us, so that no part of our human experience, even the most death-determined parts, would remain untouched by his resurrected life. Jesus entered into our suffering and death not to pay a price, but to make a way, and that way leads us to a whole redeemed, abundant life.
The murder rate in prehistoric times was much higher than we expected. When there was no law or fear of punishment, people often did what they had to do to survive, or simply just did what they wanted.
If there were no laws, there can't be a murder rate, as murder only makes sense under laws. Also, IP goes into how at one point in time, due to killings, there was one man for every 17 women. I imagine that would really leverage things to men in a way, as it really puts the whole "I wouldn't date you if you were the last man on earth" statement into question.
The idea modern societies have simply corrupted us is not backed by data. Studies also back this up. Stanley Milgram conducted the first Milgram experiments, where a subject would be brought in under the assumption that he was there to be one of two participants in a learning experiment. They were instructed to ask a person in another room a series of questions. Unbeknownst, they were actually a paid actor. If the other person answered wrong, they would have to give them an electrical shock, as ordered by the scientists. Each shock would increase in the amount of pain it caused. The actor would cry from the other room they were having heart problems, but the scientist performing the experiments would tell the subject he had to keep going, regardless of the pain they were causing the person in the other room. The results shockingly demonstrated that 65% of subjects administered all the shocks as instructed, including one that was perpetrated to give a lethal shock.
Doesn't do really anything to show humans are depraved, but rather it just shows that humans can be manipulated into doing questionable acts given a set of circumstances. This isn't a matter of morality, but a matter of authority. We will believe authority figures even if it contradicts our experience or our morals, as we assume the best in authority figures. There are many studies that go over this, such as Identifying Systematic Disobedience in Milgram's Obedience Experiments, a Meta-Analytic review by Dominic J. Packer, which showed how someone would be willing to go against the experimenter's orders when the learner first requested to be released, as people recognized the bodily autonomy of the learner being shocked over regular one. Another paper is Working Toward the Experimenter, Reconceptualizing Obedience Within the Milgram Paradigm as Identification-Based Followership by Stephen D. Rocher, which demonstrates how people can socially identify with a leader and work towards what they believe is a common goal. Another paper is Ethical Distance in Corrupt Firms, How Do Innocent Bystanders Become Guilty Perpetrators by Stelios C. Zakopoulos and Peter J. Femling, which goes into how being distant from the immoral acts and not seeing its harm makes it easier for people to do, and how many Holocaust leaders were able to carry out their orders without ever actually seeing a a death, but rather just ordering them. The last one I want to go into is From Milgram and Capaccia to Normal Organizations by Stuart Clegg and others, which tells how people can counter this sort of behavior if they are made to see themselves as agents whom contribute and not powerless cogs in a machine. I would imagine believing you are morally depraved can make you want to engage in this behavior, because why not, seeing how no matter what you do, you'd still be immoral. It's not hard to see how a strong belief in original sin and feeling powerless could lead to bad acts.
Clay Jones asks a very simple question in his book. Do gang members stop at red lights? Yes, but not because they respect that particular law. It is out of self-interest. No one wants to get sidelined by oncoming traffic. Most people do not rob banks because they don't want to go to jail. Most people do not cheat on their spouse because they don't want to destroy a marriage they may like, ruin their reputation, or lose relationships they derive meaning from.
This assumes an egotistic theory of altruism like aversive arousal reduction, which says that we help others so as to reduce our own concerns. But as psychologists Dan Batson and Nadia Amman show in their article Altruism, Myth or Reality, that empathetic concerns produces altruistic motivation, and that while helping others does come with self-benefits, that isn't the ultimate goal of it, but rather unintended consequences. They produced a number of tests and showed how we have motivation to relieve others' suffering and not the empathetic concern. To quote the article when going over egotistical explanations and how they are apparently going away, rather theory and data now being advanced are more compatible with the view that true altruism acting with the goal of benefiting another does exist and is a part of human nature.
None are righteous, no one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one.
Paul is quoting from Psalm 14:1 and Psalm 53:1, which there can be a debate over whether it was talking about pagans, people in Israel, everyone, etc. But that's sort of irrelevant to the point that this is a generalization of humans being bad, making a note that many humans do behave badly, and Jesus is here to bring a fullness to God. Nothing to do with original sin per se. People who sin against God are straying away from Him, and it will lead to suffering, which works with Luke, as you mentioned.
To put this into perspective with numbers, the UN estimates it would cost roughly $30 billion a year to end world hunger, and Americans alone wasted $116 billion in gambling in 2016.
The $30 billion to end world hunger is dubious. The UN hasn't really responded to where their estimate comes from. The problem with calculating these things has to do with the fact we don't exactly know how many people are in a state of hunger. We don't really have any credible figures, as John Greenberg points out in his article, Facebook meme, Iraq war dollars could have ended world hunger in 30 years. The reason for starvation today has more to do with government corruption preventing people from doing the labor required to produce food. This has been gone over by political scientist Alex DeWall in his book Mass Starvation. Now, despite this correction, I do get what IP is getting at, which is basically that we could be doing much more, but this isn't necessarily evil, as it is more ignorance on people's part. We generally tend to be more focused on problems surrounding our own communities for pragmatic reasons, as we are restricted in information and resources, with events closer to home just being more practical to focus on.
He made us free, and to be truly free means we have to be allowed to choose how we want to be.
Why couldn't God make everyone have only good choices? They'd still be free to choose, but good would come either way. This may be a side issue, but IP is using the privation account of evil, i.e., that evil is the absence of good, which is an account of evil that is widely rejected by scholars. G. Stanley Kane, in his paper Evil and Privation, brought that fact up. This can be attributed to the fact that on privation theory, evil pains consist solely on absence of some good, and by So a paralyzed leg and leg in pain are both just deprivations of good health. When a leg is in pain, it's a new, unique experience that is just intuitively more than deprivation. And so it doesn't account for all of human experience. This is the same for moral evil, as on it there is no difference between things we think that are bad because failed to do something and things we actually did, like assault. It's obvious there is more to it, which IP's account really doesn't go for.
The obvious reason as to why it is better to have free will and evil than to lack both is because we would simply lose our humanity. Our movies and books celebrate realities where a world of free will, along with pain and misery, is a far better alternative to a world without these things.
Why does it follow that we would lose our free will, we would lose our humanity? Couldn't God make emotions just a feature of the causal process? Emotions are not illusions, but rather just our belief that we have acted in free ways is the illusion. As Jordan Bodhisattva explains in Free Love on the relation between belief and free will, determinism and passionate love, determinism is compatible with passionate love, which makes sense since we wouldn't like it if someone could just stop loving us at will, and the whole notions of love at first sight and falling in love both rely on a notion of love being out of our control. Dirk Perboom in Free Will, Love, and Anger gives an example of how parents love their children, rarely because they freely choose to be that way, and the same with relationships. Many things like appearance and that person's history, which are out of other people's control for a good part, is very important in attraction. Love for another involves wishing well for another and a desire to be together with someone, and compatibilism or even determinism doesn't undermine that. Actions can be lovable regardless if they merit praise. Lastly, on this topic, it also may be pointed out that free will might be a bad thing, as the paper Unjust Deserts, The Dark Side of Morality by Greg de Carroza goes to show that if we gave up the notion of moral responsibility, that would make us give up our retributive and severe punishment mindset for people. Instead, it would just make us treat bad people as people that need to be separated from society, like sick people, and give them treatment. It might help us get rid of our often destructive notion of moral anger.
Ask yourself this. Would you as a healthy adult want to spend a lifetime married to a lifeless robot who always does what you command, never speaks to you as a free agent, or engages in an honest discussion?
Sounds like my ex in a nutshell. In all seriousness though, people get blow-up dolls all the time that fit that description, and some people you could say are better off for it, as if they got a real woman, they'd have to chance at best their heart being broken in your average BFGF relationship, or at worst chance losing their livelihood in a divorce. Also, this analogy assumes that I would be a free agent and my wife would be the robot, when in reality we both would be the robots. And if you have two robots that say they love each other, whom is to say that isn't good enough? From an outsider perspective, and without being told beforehand, you really couldn't tell a difference between a full deterministic human-looking robot couple and just free human beings. The robots would be expressing care for one another, and I don't see how them being deterministic would make it less valuable. Many people would just like to have a partner love them because they're attracted to them, not because they were free to do so. To say we can't experience true love, or that it's somehow less if we are determined, reminds me of people who say we can't come to truth if we are determined, even though calculators come to truth all the time, and they are deterministic. Also, the fact a calculator is deterministic doesn't seem to affect its value to me. The problem isn't with being causally determined per se, but rather how we are causally determined, and whether there are any faults in the process. If someone spiked your drink with a love potion to make you fall in love with them, that would seem to be pretty objectionable, but let's say you have a destructive habit of loving people that hurt you, and a person gives you this drug in order to fix that, and you fall in love with them after that. That would seem to not be as objectionable, so it seems love is perfectly compatible without free will.
Avengers Infinity Wars provides an excellent analogy. Doctor Strange looked into the future and could only see one possible way to save the most number of people. But that way involved a lot of pain and death, given the free choices of evil creatures. Likewise, given God's middle knowledge, where he can only actualize a world that works with the free choices of creatures, there are no possible worlds where God could create a world where we are free and there is no evil or misfortune. God would actualize the world where there is the least amount of evil, while taking human free choices into account. Therefore, the argument is, given human freedom within middle knowledge, God might not be able to actualize perfect worlds or worlds with less evil, because there are no possible worlds where we are free and always do the right thing, or do the right thing more often.
I've gone over the problems with this before, but I'll offer another challenge for the Molinist here. Joseph Schieber wrote a paper entitled Personal Responsibility in Middle Knowledge, a Challenge for the Molinist, which shows how personal responsibility is negated by Molinism by the use of the transfer of negative responsibility argument. To summarize the point, if drinking root beer isn't under my control, and drinking root beer entails I burp, then it follows burping isn't under my control. Biblically speaking, if Adam eating the forbidden fruit is not under God's control, and if Adam eating the forbidden fruit entails Adam getting kicked out of the garden, then Adam getting kicked out of the garden wasn't under God's control. This shows we don't have control of the actionalization of the actionalizable.
But couldn't God just actively prevent more evil? When the Nazis lined up the Jews to be shot, why didn't he just make the guns jam or cause an earthquake to form a great chasm between them both? Such a world would not have freedom. It would be a playpen with an overprotective mother.
This sounds like process theology, which to IP's credit, I think is one of the better answers to the problem of evil. This does have its problems, as Andrei Bukharov goes into in Divine Freedom and Creaturely Suffering in Process Theology. To quote it, on the process model, God's ability to freely respond to suffering is curtailed to the extent that divine co-suffering is more akin to what one would expect from someone locked in a prison with another suffering the same torment, but not willingly.
But couldn't God teach us another way? Given the self-centered nature of humanity, I ask how? Some have suggested God ought to provide dreams to warn people, but that is assuming we would even listen. Growing up, my parents warned me not to do a number of stupid things. I did them anyway, as we all did when we were kids. There has been a Surgeon General warning on cigarette packets for decades. People still smoke.
What you were talking about is psychological states. It may be the case that people have a tendency to ignore warnings, but note these are psychological states that people have and are not really in control of. For example, as Dr. Kelly Clark points out in his lecture on the topic of atheism and autism, autistic people have a hard time relating to persons, and by consequence of having a hard time of relating to persons, they have a hard time relating to a personal God, and thus are more likely to not believe in one. Now note the autistic person had no say in being autistic, as that is a result of genetics and environmental influences at an early age. But yet, still this is supposedly loving God has allowed said autistic person to be at no fault of their own predisposed to not believing in him. The same can be said about a lot of genetic mental disorders that predispose someone to what Christians consider sins. God to allow that isn't just necessarily endangering others, but is also sort of cruel to those mentally ill people, as had God gave them normal, rationally functioning brains, they would have fared better at coming to a loving relationship with Christ and have more of a say in making free choices.
History seems to show that hardships cause more people to turn to God. Patrick Johnstone has noted in his work that Christianity tends to grow more in countries that have faced severe hardship.
So more people don't turn to God out of logical thought and evaluating the evidence, but more so out of emotional duress, from which we know can make people do irrational things. That really doesn't sound like an honest God, but rather as like the abusive husband who beats his wife not because he had a rational reason to do so, but rather because he realized doing so got his wife to give him more affection than he deserved. This is a problem that I have with revealed religions. While they claim God is not a human, they ascribe pretty much all the attributes of humans to God. This degrades the great architect and makes him no more than a magical, unseen human being.
There are a lot of gods that offer joy for our misery, but sit distantly away, never experiencing as we experience, never suffering human pain as we suffer. Not with this God. There is only one God that plunged himself into pain to save us. You want to know the answer to a world filled with torture and murder? It is a God who was tortured and murdered to wipe away every tear and sadness.
Jesus wasn't murdered. He was at best wrongly executed under the law at the time. It wasn't illegal to kill Jesus as it was sanctioned by the law of his time. Also, yes, big sacrifice. Under Christianity, Jesus got to live a unique experience as both God and man. Along with that, the quality of his suffering is sort of minimized by the fact he had rose. Had Jesus went to hell and stayed there so no one else would have to go, that would be a greater sacrifice than the suffering that he got on this earth. Well, this has to be one of my longest vids, but I can say I'm proud of it. I feel I've brought up some interesting points that need to be considered. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.